He didn't say a single word when he stood up to leave. No speech, no glare for the cameras, just that tight, clenched look in his jaw, the kind that shows up when someone is trying to keep everything contained. Then the door shut behind him. And that's when the real question hit. If this was supposed to be Prince Harry's final stand, why did it end in silence? Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't just another loss you scroll past. This wasn't celebrity drama. This was the closing chapter of a case Harry has framed for years as something bigger than himself. His fight against Britain's tabloid machine, the culture of intrusion, the system that he believes helped destroy his family long before it ever listened to it. But on Monday, in the UK's highest court, the story didn't end with vindication. It ended with a ruling, clean, procedural, final. And if you were paying attention, you could feel something shift. Not loudly, not theatrically, but unmistakably. Like the air had thinned, like hope had quietly started to fall apart. So what exactly did Prince Harry lose? And why does it matter more now than it ever has? Here's what makes this different. Harry has taken on multiple media giants over the years, claims tied to phone hacking, data misuse, unlawful surveillance, and a long trail of alleged tabloid overreach. But this case was meant to be the decisive one, the clear shot, the legal moment that would force the British system to put something in black and white, that the pattern wasn't imagined and the damage wasn't abstract. Instead, it didn't land that way. It didn't explode. It didn't even roar. It fizzled. Maybe worse than that, it failed. But the loss itself isn't what has legal analysts and royal watchers leaning in. It's how it happened. Because from what's being reported, the judges didn't necessarily slam the door on the idea that wrongdoing could have occurred. The court's posture wasn't, "This never happened." It was, "This is not what the law can stretch to cover, at least not now, and not like this." That distinction sounds small until you realize what it implies. If harm can be acknowledged in the background, but not acted on in the foreground, what does that say about justice? What does it say about power? And the hardest question of all, what does it say about Prince Harry? Because if this really was the last card in his legal hand, what happens next? More lawsuits? A public campaign? A complete withdrawal? Something nobody's ready to say out loud? We'll get there. But not all at once, because there's a detail almost no one is talking about. A moment just before the ruling. A look exchanged. Fingers tightening. A subtle cue between lawyers that, according to someone in the room, signaled a truth no one wanted to admit. They knew. They knew it wasn't going their way. And they knew what that would mean beyond the paperwork. Which raises the next hook in this story. If the writing was on the wall, why did Harry come back anyway? What was he really fighting for? And how much of it was ever about law versus proving something far more personal? Let's walk inside that courtroom, the clues, the contradictions, the slow collapse. Because what came after was the part nobody expected. This wasn't just a trip back to London, it was a walk back into the lion's den. So why now? Why step into the same arena that, in his view, twisted his image for years, reshaped his narrative into something he barely recognizes, and by many accounts refused to hear him the first time? Why risk it all? Because that's what this was. A risk, not a ceremonial appearance, not a tidy PR calculation. Harry came back to fight. But even before he sat down in that courtroom, the cracks were visible. You could see it in the way his legal team huddled that morning, close, tense, low-voiced. Not the energy of bold strategy, more like restraint, containment, damage control. You could feel it in the crowd outside, less supportive, more skeptical. And you could sense it in Harry himself. His shoulders didn't look squared, his eyes didn't scan the press the way they used to. This wasn't defiance, it was something quieter. A man stepping into what might be his last chance to be taken seriously by a system he believes has ignored him for years. And the setting mattered, the UK's highest court. This isn't a place built for spectacle, no chaos, no drama, just precedent, procedure, protocol. Three things that don't care how much pain is in the room. which is exactly why this moment felt so strange. Because everything about Harry's broader battle has been emotional. In earlier proceedings, his testimony was raw, at times confessional. He described the press as an enemy. He accused them of ruining lives, manipulating narratives, surveilling him unlawfully. He spoke about Meghan, about Diana, about trauma that didn't end when the headlines moved on. For Harry, this has never been just litigation. It's been catharsis. But courts like this one aren't designed for catharsis. They don't recognize grief as evidence. They don't weigh heartbreak the way the public does. So the question hangs. Was Harry prepared for that reality? Or was he hoping this court, unlike the tabloids, might finally listen? And here's the contradiction no one likes to say out loud. Harry was asking an institution he's publicly distrusted to now defend him, to validate his experience, to tell the world he wasn't paranoid, he was right. That contradiction doesn't survive long in a room like this. Because behind those walls, the judges weren't measuring emotion. They were measuring law, statute, the weight of precedent, the boundaries of what can be proven and what can be acted on. And as arguments unfolded, it became clear they weren't bending. Harry sat there, listening, waiting, maybe for a flicker of recognition, a question that leaned his way, a sign that the room understood the magnitude of what he believed was at stake. It didn't come. Then, during the first break, something subtle shifted. One of the barristers leaned in, barely. No dramatic movement, no flurry of notes, just a brief exchange of eyes, then a glance downward. The kind of moment that looks meaningless to outsiders but feels heavy to anyone who's ever watched a case turn. Harry didn't stand right away. He stayed seated, jaw tight, hands folded, and it felt like something had quietly left the room. What followed wasn't in the script. What followed wasn't planned. Because what do you do when you realize the decision has already been made? That's the weight that settled in, like dust after a slammed door. No shouting, no theatrics. Just that unmistakable shift legal professionals recognize instinctively. When the tone turns purely procedural, when the bench goes still, when the room stops entertaining possibility. That's when you know the law is moving on without you. And that's exactly what it felt like. Prince Harry on one side, his team silent and unreadable, and across from them, a judiciary that had already begun to pull away. Because here's the reality. Courts at this level are not moved by passion. They aren't designed to empathize. They're designed to interpret, detached, disciplined, and sometimes cold. It's how precedent survives. But Harry wasn't built for detachment. Not in this fight. His written submissions spoke of betrayal, invasion, psychological harm, not as a performance, but as something he believes is etched into the story of his life. He wasn't asking for sympathy, at least not directly. He was asking for acknowledgement. He wanted someone in power to say, yes, you were wronged, you were watched, you were manipulated, but that isn't what the law gave him. By most accounts, the judges stayed clinical, focused. They didn't necessarily deny that the press had overstepped in the past, but they questioned whether this specific claim, this final battle, met the legal burden required. Had it been brought too late? Did it depend too heavily on inference? Was it built on assumption rather than hard evidence? They weren't debating morality. They were drawing a boundary. And that's where the tension thickened, because Harry's side leaned harder into pattern, ethics, the broader sickness of a tabloid culture that profits from intrusion. But the bench narrowed its gaze as if to say, that isn't why we're here. If you watched closely, you could see discomfort rise. Harry shifting in his chair, the small tightening in his jaw. No interruption, no gestures, just the posture of someone realizing the emotional core of his argument was evaporating under legal scrutiny. Then one of the justices asked a question, brief, technical, almost sterile. And it landed like a blow, because it wasn't about truth. It was about timing. Whether the case, valid or not, had come too late to matter. Harry looked down, not in dramatic defeat, but in something worse. Disbelief. Because in that moment, it hit. The court wasn't necessarily doubting harm occurred. It was questioning whether it could still do anything about it, whether it could still care, legally. And when the ruling finally came, it arrived exactly as rulings do in rooms like this: dry, procedural, delivered with the neutral cadence of a system trained to never flinch. Harry didn't react the way some expected. No outburst, no visible explosion, just stillness. But the silence cut, because this wasn't simply unfavorable. This was final. The end of a legal arc that has stretched for years, across headlines, across continents, across the emotional terrain of a family story the world has consumed for decades. And when the justices confirmed they would not expand legal protections the way Harry had hoped, would not alter the framework around press intrusion, it became clear the system had spoken, and it wasn't going to bend. Not for a prince, not for a husband, not even for a son still haunted by what cameras did to his mother. His exit wasn't rushed, but it wasn't carefully staged either. It was abrupt, like something internal had finally given way. He was gone before reporters even fully registered it. 1 second, seated behind the table, surrounded by paper and murmurs. The next, empty space. Some described his expression as thunderous. Others said hollow. But the part nobody agrees on is the part that matters most. What does this mean? Because if this was the last major attempt to hold the media legally accountable for what Harry sees as years of surveillance, manipulation, and psychological warfare, then one door didn't just close, it may have locked. Yes, he can appeal. But the odds, according to people familiar with cases at this level, are razor thin. And even if he tried to refile under a different claim, the judiciary's appetite for stretching into this territory appears to be waning. That's the quiet message, the one not spelled out in the judgment but felt between the lines. So where does that leave him? That's the real question. If courts are no longer a viable route, if legal mechanisms have proven insufficient or unwilling to address what he insists is systemic violation, what's left? A return to public pressure? A media exposé? A broader campaign? Or something darker? A complete withdrawal from institutional engagement altogether? Because here's what one source close to the case has quietly hinted at. The plan was never to walk away. But after this verdict, he may be forced to. And if Prince Harry truly turns his back on the British system, the next chapter won't stay contained in courtrooms. He came looking for judgment, and he got it. Just not the kind he was prepared to carry. Because this wasn't only a legal decision. It was a statement delivered without warmth, stripped of context, and intentionally devoid of sympathy. That's how courts work. They don't speak in metaphors. They don't weigh heartbreak. They rule on what the law permits, not what it morally owes. And that might be the sharpest edge of this entire story. Because Harry wasn't only asking for damages, privacy, or precedent. He was asking for recognition, not from the public, not from the press, but from the very system he believes failed him and failed his mother. And in return, the system answered with something that felt like a shrug. To be clear, the ruling doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't absolve tabloids. It doesn't declare him a liar. It barely speaks to the emotional reality at all. It says something colder. Your claim came too late. Your evidence didn't meet the threshold. The law does not move just because you need it to. And that leaves us with silence. Not the silence of dignity, the silence of something unresolved. So where does Prince Harry go from here? Does he escalate publicly? Retreat quietly? Or, as some whisper behind closed doors, does he finally step out of the legal arena entirely? Because when someone exhausts every formal route to defend what they believe is the truth, what's left? Do you take it back to the press you once fought? Do you write another memoir? Do you disappear? These aren't rhetorical questions anymore. These are choices staring him in the face. And whatever he chooses next won't just define him. It will echo across institutions, across his family, across public opinion. And maybe, just maybe, this loss wasn't the end of a war. Maybe it was the beginning of a quieter, more dangerous kind of confrontation. One that doesn't unfold in courtrooms or headlines, but in whispers, between power and consequence, between truth and what the system allows to survive. So now we're left with one haunting question. If the courts no longer believe they can help, who does he turn to next? And even more unsettling, who is still willing to listen? If you've been following this case, or if you have thoughts about what this ruling really means, not just for Prince Harry, but for privacy, institutions, and legacy, share what you think, because this story isn't over. And the silence, it may only be beginning.